Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to probably cover the most information that we're ever going to cover in a single lesson within this course. And that's going to be talking about geometry managers. We're going to look at how each of the three work and what sort of configuration values we can use with them. So for the first one, we're going to talk about pack. We're going to move on to talk about the grid manager and then finally the place manager. For each of the geometry manager methods that we work with, there are a lot of parameters that we can work with. And some of them are not the most intuitive, and they take a little while to actually understand what exactly is going on. So the best way that I have figured out to go about this is to show you a lot of examples where we modify just one little bit of code working with the exact same couple widgets on screen so that we can see what the differences are. But just going through the list here, anchor is going to be how we actually go and say where we want to pin something inside of the space that pack has allotted for it. By default, this is center. So this is why when we just pack something onto our window, it's going to be at the top by default, but then it's also going to be centered horizontally. Expand allows us to say whether or not the widget should grow to fit its surroundings, which can be very handy. Fill says whether or not it should grow in the specific directions around it. So you can say I should fill in the X direction, or I should fill in the Y direction, or I should fill in both. And expand doesn't do anything unless there are other things around. Fill will work if there's just one widget by itself. So you'll have to see these in tandem in order to really understand exactly what's going on too. The in parameter is one that you should basically just never use. It allows you to essentially specify a separate master that you would be putting something into, but don't do that. So yeah, that's all I'm really going to say is just don't use that one. Side allows us to say that we want to pack to the side rather than the top, or we can pack straight to the bottom rather than the side or the top. And then we get into our paddings. So I padding is the internal padding, and then the normal padding, so pad X and pad Y, those are going to be the external padding. And you'd probably hear this referred to as margin if you were thinking about it from web development. So let's dig into this, just looking at first with side and pad. So you can see for each of the labels that we have here, we've added some internal padding of 30 pixels. That's why it's a lot bigger. And then for each of them, we picked a different place to actually go to for the side. So the first one, we just use the default, which is going to pack it to the top. Label 2, we put to the left, and you can use the string left, or you can use the constants that are part of the tkinter module. I tend to use the constant, so I will do something like tk dot all caps left. And then for the third one, we put it to the right. So even though we are still using pack with the same three labels here, if we had just done pack, 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 they would have just gone from top to bottom. We would have seen blue, red, and green stacked on top of each other. But doing it this way, we can actually pin them to different sides of the window. If we change just a few things around and we take a look at if we put them all on the left side, we set the fill to none and expand to true, what happens? And what you can see here is they actually all take an equal amount of space, and there's kind of empty space around them. But if you looked at the amount of empty space that's to the left of label 1 and to the right of label 1, there would essentially be the same amount of empty space there, but then label 2 got the exact same amount of space. So it makes the margins in the middle twice as big. If we say that we're not expanding with label 1 and we're not expanding with label 3, then label 2 is going to expand and it's going to take up all that space. So if you were to actually resize this window, label 1 and label 3 would always stay on the outsides and label 2 would always stay in the center because it's always expanding and being centered into the position that it was at. Moving on to fill, we can work with this a little bit longer. And you can see that when you're filling, it's actually going to cause it to essentially change the dimensions of the widget that you're using. So even though we had internal padding of 30 on both of those, when we set fill to both on label 2, it's going to expand so it takes up all of that space that was given to it by being expanded, right? So that's why we're getting into such a giant size difference here. But you'll see that for label 3, we are also filling in both directions, but since it is not set to expand, it doesn't take up any extra space left to right, but it has some empty space available to it in the Y plane there. So it can actually change to be taller. Now we can take a look at what padding looks like. And padding is going to be the space on the outside of our widget. And you'll notice that even if we're set to fill in both directions, that now this is actually taking space away from label 2, because previously it was filling all the way to the top and all the way to the sides. But by setting some external padding on it, we're saying that there always needs to be this little bit of extra space on the outside of the widget. Looking at anchor, we're going to see that it's all about cardinal directions. So there's northwest is what we're looking at here. North is going to be the center, and then we'll see all of the variations of this. But we can take something that was pinned to the left side and anchor it to the northwest, and that will actually put it to that top corner there. But then everything around it is going to flow in the same direction. These are all of the anchoring points that we can work with. We can say northwest, north, northeast, west, center, east, and then southwest, south, and southeast. Moving on to the grid. This one is also going to have quite a few parameters, but they make quite a bit of sense. So padding is going to be the same. We're going to see that every time. Column and column span specify which column we're in. So it's going to default to 0. And then column span is going to say how many columns wide is this particular widget. Same thing for row and row span. You're going to start at 0 for the row, but then as we grid more things on, so as we call the grid method, it's going to default by setting the next row so that things don't overlap. Because if something's at column 0, row 0, then you don't obviously want the next widget that you add to just be right on top of it. So it's going to auto increment the row if you don't specify it yourself. Once again, we see that in is here, don't use it. And then the sticky one here works kind of like anchor, except for it's localized to the amount of space that the cell in the grid would have. So in order to make something truly feel like it is 2 columns wide, you normally have to use sticky. But digging into this, just the default that we have here, using some padding to make things a little bit bigger, you'll see that it just essentially stacks them, but we're no longer centered. Then if we want to go ahead and specify the columns, you'll notice that if we just specify the column to 1, that's the default behavior. But then we get into the situation where we specify different columns, and you'll notice that it puts them further and further to the right. In each situation, the row is being incremented though, so we're never in the situation where we're stacked on top of each other. If we go and we specify the row ourselves, we can put everything into the same row. So you can say that it needs to be column 1, row 1, column 2, row 1, column 3, row 1, and then you can put things in a line. Or you could say something like this. And the things to note here are that even though we say row 3, it's not really putting it in row 3. It's putting it in row 2 because there's nothing in row 2 before. So it's going to put label 2 into row 2. It doesn't just automatically make an empty space there, which is kind of a bummer. Next, we can get into using column span. So this is where things get a little bit odd. And that is we are spanning 3 columns here. And that is because we put label 3 into column 3. And even though there's nothing in column 2, there's still kind of an empty thing there. So if we wanted it to span both as wide as label 1 and label 3 are, then we need to go ahead and do it this way. So we're spanning the 3 columns, and then it's going to position the label in the center though. So if we want to go ahead and change how that looks though, we can specify sticky is going to be the east, and that will allow us to move it further over. But you can also do combinations here. So you can specify that I need to be sticky to the east and sticky to the west, and that allows us to do this, where we can have a different label that is actually multiple columns wide. So this is where I was mentioning that in order to really span multiple columns, a lot of times you're going to need to utilize sticky in some way like this. Combining row span and col span can get a little bit weird, but in the same way that column span allowed us to be wider than we normally were, row span allows us to be taller than we normally were, or shorter, depending on how you would actually specify that there. But yeah, you can span multiple rows, and that will allow you to be a little bit more vertical. Moving past the grid here, we can move into using the place manager. And this one is very deliberate. Everything we do is going to be pretty specific. So X and Y allow us to specify the coordinates. Height and width allow us to specify the height and width. Anchor doesn't quite work the same way that it did before. So when you anchor something to center, it's going to place the center of the widget at the X and Y coordinates that you specify. So to get the behavior that we are probably normally expecting, you're going to want to anchor to the northwest. That will place the top left of the widget at the point that you specify with XY. You can specify a border mode to say how it should utilize space around the widget. So you can say inside, outside, or ignore are kind of the options there. And we kind of need to see that one in action to really understand exactly what's going on. But the really interesting ones that we're going to run into are going to be rel height and width, which takes a float value from 0 to 1, essentially, that allow you to specify that you want the width or the height to be a ratio relative to the height and width of its container. So if you want something to be half the size of its container, then it's going to have a rel height of 0.5. Rel X and Y work the same way, except for it's going to be positioning it. So you can say rel X to be 0.5 is going to position it at exactly halfway. And this will allow you to create widgets that are placed and expandable, and they kind of adjust to what's around them and size-wise. So if you readjust the window size, that's going to change the relative positioning that it needs to use with relative X and Y. So that's pretty handy. And in works the same way that it did previously. If you're going down the route of using the place geometry manager, you might want to use in. That's really up to you, but for most situations, you're not going to need it. So looking at how we can place things with X and Y, remember that we're placing from the top left as our origin there. So this is going 5 pixels in both the X and the Y direction, and that's going to be anchored on the northwest side of our widget. That's why you can see that the top left of label 1 is probably 5 pixels in both directions from the top corner. And then 40 and 80 allowed us to move a little bit more down there to have kind of a stair-step effect here. Adjusting width and height works the way you would probably expect. You don't need to specify either of them. It'll go ahead and actually determine that based on the size of the widget's content. But if you do want something to be a specific size, then you can go ahead and say what the width should be. So we can see here that we are anchored to the northwest. This is the default behavior, as I mentioned. If we change that to be center, though, you'll notice that we're essentially off screen, and that's because we're going 0, 0, but we're putting the halfway point or the exact center both horizontally and vertically at 0, 0. So it moves things in a direction that we probably don't want. But we could position something exactly the same way. If we knew the height and the width and the X and the Y, we could adjust those things. So because it is 30 in height and 200 wide, we can say that we want to put it at X 100 and Y of 30 and center it, and it's going to look exactly like if we had just anchored it to 0, 0 using TK Northwest as the anchor. Rel X and Rel Y, as I mentioned, I think are incredibly useful. So to position something essentially halfway down here, we were able to use rel X 0, 0 and then rel Y of 0.5. If we wanted to position it in the dead center and have it be of a relative height and width to the container itself, then we can combine it with rel height and rel width, and we can use TK center to actually center it. So there's equal space in all directions around this label. Border mode is an interesting one here, and to show this, I had to create a frame, and I put a gigantic border on it. So it has a 40-point border, and it's sunken so that it has that kind of look to it there. But you can see with label 1, we have just the default border mode of inside, which you'll see that places us inside of our container's border. With label 2, even though frame is our container, we set the border mode to TK outside, and that set our positioning to be essentially ignoring the container or considering the container in what we're doing. So since we put it at rel 0, 0 with border mode of outside, it's going to put it at the exact beginning of where our frame starts in the X and Y. So that's going to be where the 0 would be here for us. So that puts it to where we can overlap with the border. A lot of times you're probably going to want to put things inside the border, which is why it's the default, but occasionally you'll want to bust outside of that border. So there's a lot of information covered in this lesson, and the things to remember here is that Pack is pretty simple, and it allows you to make some interesting, flexible designs. But if you need something that's a lot more structured and would be good for something where you're creating maybe a form, then Grid is really good for that because it allows you to specify positioning with a little bit more control. And then Place is incredibly powerful, but it requires you to be very specific in what you're doing. So occasionally you might need to use something like this, but I would try to leverage Pack and Grid where you can. And you can use both Pack and Grid within the same application. You're able to do that. You just can't use it within the same container. So if you are packing things into the root of your application, then you have to continue to pack things at that level. But that doesn't mean you can't pack a frame into the root of your application and then use Grid within that frame to place all of the widgets that are in the frame. So you can mix and match these things, but it's good to know that each of them is good at its own thing, and knowing when to use them will allow you to build a lot better application designs.